The document was already signed. That was the part that broke Julia Cooper's breath in half when she saw it. The government seal pressed into wax at the bottom of the page, red as a wound, and Marshal Chester Lockhart standing in the middle of her father's parlor with the paper held out like an offering, like she was supposed to simply take it and say thank you and watch 30 years of her family's blood and sweat get swallowed by the Transcontinental Land Authority without so much as a funeral. "You need to understand," Chester said, and his voice was the kind of low, measured thing that told her he had said hard truths to hard people before and had learned to keep the emotion out of it, that this order came directly from the federal office in Denver. The Cooper Ranch, all 4,200 acres of it, falls within the designated corridor for the new rail expansion. This isn't negotiation. This is notification. Julia did not take the paper. She looked at this man, tall, broad-shouldered, dark-eyed under the brim of a smoke-gray hat, a Marshal star pinned clean and bright against his leather vest, and she felt something inside her chest that was equal parts fury and something she could not yet name, something that frightened her more than the document did. "My father is dying," she said quietly. Chester's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Miss Cooper, he is dying in the next room," she continued, her voice not rising, not breaking, each word placed with the deliberate precision of a woman who had learned that rage was most effective when it was cold. "He has been dying for 11 weeks. The doctor says he will not last another month, and you are standing in his parlor on his land, holding a paper that says the government is going to take everything he built before he even has the dignity of dying on it. So I am going to ask you just once, Marshal Lockhart, to tell me who gave the order and why it could not have waited 60 days. Chester looked at her for a long moment. The late afternoon light was coming through the parlor window, and it caught the copper in her dark hair and the particular set of her jaw, which was not the jaw of a frightened woman at all. It was the jaw of someone preparing for war. "The railroad doesn't wait," he said, and hated himself for it the moment the words were out. Julia Cooper took one step toward him, and though she stood half a foot shorter than he did, Chester Lockhart, who had faced down wanted men in 3 territories, who had ridden alone into Apache country and come back with his scalp, who had never in his professional life been made to feel small, felt the room shift. "Then," she said softly, "I suppose we are going to have a very interesting problem, Marshal." She turned and walked out the back door, and Chester was left standing with a government document in his hand, the wax seal still gleaming, and the absolute certain knowledge that whatever he had expected to find in Sweetwater County, New Mexico Territory, in the spring of 1882, it had not been her. The trouble had started, as most troubles in the New Mexico Territory started in that decade, with money and land and the appetite of men who had neither but wanted both. Chester Lockhart had been a federal marshal for 6 years, by the time the assignment landed on his desk in Santa Fe. Before that he had been an Army scout for 3 years, and before that a ranch hand in Texas, and before that a boy who had grown up poor and hungry in Missouri and had decided early that the only antidote to powerlessness was competence. He had made himself competent at many things: tracking, reading terrain, reading men, staying calm when everything around him was on fire. He was 32 years old, and he had the kind of face that had accumulated experience without going soft angular, weathered, with dark eyes that noticed everything and gave away very little. The assignment that came across his desk in March of 1882 was a land acquisition order on behalf of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway, which was pushing its expansion south through New Mexico Territory and needed a corridor of land to do it. The Transcontinental Land Authority, which was the federal body that existed specifically to ease this kind of transaction, had identified the Cooper Ranch outside the town of Clearwater Creek as sitting directly in the path of the proposed line. The authority had sent 2 previous agents to serve the notification paperwork. Both had come back empty-handed and shaken, reporting that the Cooper Ranch was occupied by a sick old man, and a daughter who had reportedly met the first agent at the property line with a loaded Henry rifle and told him in specific and anatomical terms where he could store his paperwork. Chester's supervisor, a former Union officer named Alderman Briggs who smelled perpetually of bay rum and political ambition, had dropped the file on Chester's desk and said, "I'm sending you because you're the only man I've got who won't either shoot somebody or get shot." Chester had read the file on the ride south. The Cooper Ranch had been established in 1851 by a man named William Cooper, who had come west from Virginia with his wife Eleanor and built from nothing. Eleanor Cooper had died of fever in 1863, leaving William with a daughter who had been born in 1860 and named Julia. The ranch itself, the Diamond Sea, as it was known in the territory, ran cattle on some of the finest grazing land in the county. 4,200 acres of grass and water and high desert range, with a creek running through the south quarter that never dried even in drought years. The file noted that the ranch was well run and profitable, which meant the railroad wanted it badly enough to pay, and the land authority was authorized to offer a settlement of $12,000 for the forced purchase, which Chester had privately thought, reading it on horseback, was an insult dressed up as a gift. He had arrived in Clearwater Creek on a Tuesday afternoon in late April, gotten a room at the only hotel, spoken with the sheriff, a decent man named Orrin Webb who had immediately looked sorry for Chester when he heard why the marshal was there, and ridden out to the Diamond Sea on Wednesday morning. He had not expected the document to already be signed when he arrived. That part still nagged at him 2 hours later, sitting in the Silver Fork Saloon in town with a glass of whiskey he was not drinking, turning the situation over in his mind. The document had been prepared in Denver and had come to him pre-sealed with instructions to present it as final. It was not technically a negotiating document. It was a notice of acquisition. The land sale was, in the eyes of the federal government, already concluded. The Coopers had 30 days to vacate. Chester knew, because he had been doing this work long enough, that final in government terms and moral in human terms were frequently not the same country. He was still sitting with that thought when the saloon doors opened and Julia Cooper walked in. The entire room went quiet in the particular way that frontier saloons went quiet when something unexpected entered, not hostile, exactly, but alert, the way a herd animal lifts its head. Julia Cooper walked through that silence like she had been born inside it. She was wearing riding clothes, dark trousers, a linen work shirt, boots that were dirty from the ride-in, and she carried a leather satchel that looked full and heavy. She scanned the room once, found Chester at his table in the corner, and walked directly to him. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down without being invited. "I need 30 minutes," she said, "and I need you to actually listen, not just hear." Chester looked at her for a moment and then pushed his untouched whiskey aside. "All right," he said. She opened the satchel and set a series of documents on the table between them. Chester looked at them and felt the first real surprise of the day, because they were not letters or pleas or character references. They were legal documents. Survey maps, land grant certificates, federal correspondence, and they were organized with a precision that told him she had not assembled them in a panic this afternoon. She had been preparing this for a long time. The original land grant for the Diamond Sea was issued in 1851 by the federal government under the Land Ordinance Provision for Western Expansion, Julia said, placing the first document in front of him. "It is a full patent grant, not a homestead claim. It carries different legal protections. Specifically, Section 14 of the Grant Charter, which I have right here, specifies that a patent grant can only be compulsorily acquired by the federal government under eminent domain law, and that eminent domain in New Mexico Territory in 1882 requires a territorial court ruling before any acquisition order becomes enforceable." Chester picked up the document and read it. "There has been no territorial court ruling," she continued. Your document from the land authority, I noticed the seal on it when you held it out, bears a Denver federal stamp, not a Santa Fe territorial court stamp, which means it is not legally enforceable in New Mexico territory. Not yet. Chester set the paper down very carefully. He looked at her across the table. How do you know territorial law? I taught myself, she said simply. My father taught me to read when I was 3, and by the time I was 10, I had read every book in our house. When I was 16, a lawyer named Thomas Arkin came through Clearwater Creek and stayed with us for a month while his horse recovered from a thrown shoe. He had a case library. I read all of it. When I was 18, I started corresponding with him. He has been sending me legal texts and relevant case rulings for 6 years. She paused and looked at him steadily. I know exactly what rights this land grant gives my family. I have known for a long time that someone would eventually come for this land, because the water rights alone make it worth more than anyone is admitting. So I prepared. Chester sat back in his chair. He had ridden into the Diamond Sea that morning expecting, if he was honest with himself, to find grief and stubbornness. A sick old man and a woman clinging to something she did not have the knowledge or the means to protect. He had expected to feel sorry for her. He had expected to feel, in the practiced and weary way of a man who did difficult work for the government, that regret was a luxury he could not afford. He had not expected this. He picked up another document from the stack, a letter he saw from the governor's office in Santa Fe. He read it, set it down, picked up a third. You wrote to the governor, he said, 2 months ago, before your office sent the first agent. I had already heard through the land surveyor in Clearwater Creek that the rail corridor was being planned and that our property was in the path of it. I did not wait to be surprised. And the governor responded. The governor's office responded. They acknowledged that the land grant charter issue creates a legal complication that has not been resolved. That letter is what your land authority should have been dealing with before they printed a pre-signed acquisition document with a Denver federal seal on it. She looked at him with those dark, direct eyes, and Chester noticed for the first time that they were a complicated shade brown at the center, amber at the rim, the kind of color that changed with the light. Marshal Lockhart, I am not asking you to abandon your duty. I am telling you that the order you were given to execute is, at minimum, legally premature. What I am asking is for you to take this information back to the land authority and insist that the proper territorial court process be followed before anyone asks my family to leave this land. Chester was quiet for a moment. You understand, he said carefully, that if I do that, if I report this back to Denver, it starts a legal process that could take months, and there are men involved in this railroad expansion who do not enjoy delays. I'm aware, Julia said. Those men have money and lawyers and the governor's ear on 3 different days of the week. I know that too. Then you know that this isn't just a legal problem, it's a political one. And political problems in this territory have a way of becoming dangerous. She met his gaze without flinching. My father built this ranch with his hands. He has been bleeding into this soil for 30 years. He is dying 50 yards from where he was happiest. I am not going to let it be taken by a document that was illegally prepared. So yes, Marshal, I understand the danger. I have understood it for 2 months. That has not changed my position. Chester looked at her for a long moment. Outside the saloon, Clearwater Creek was going about its afternoon business. The sound of horses, a hammer somewhere, someone calling across the street. The ordinary sounds of a small frontier town. And here at this corner table, a woman he had known for approximately 2 hours had just laid out a more coherent legal argument than anything his supervisor in Santa Fe had given him, and had done it with a quiet ferocity that he could feel like heat from a banked fire. He made a decision. Let me see all of it, he said. Every document you have. I want to read everything. For the first time since she had sat down, something shifted in Julia Cooper's face. It was not relief exactly. It was more like the very careful, very controlled lowering of a guard that had been held up by nothing but will. You'll help, she said. I'm going to look at the legal situation, he said precisely. That's my job. If the acquisition order is procedurally invalid, I have a duty to report that. That's not helping you. That's doing my job correctly. She looked at him for another moment and then nodded once with a gravity that told him she understood exactly what he was really saying and was willing to accept the careful terms of it. They stayed at that table until the saloon keeper lit the oil lamps, reading through everything she had assembled. Chester had a sharp legal mind. He had needed one in 6 years of federal work, and he asked precise questions, and she answered every single one of them without hesitation, without guessing, from memory when the document was not immediately to hand. By the time the lamp oil had burned down an inch, he had reached a conclusion that settled in his chest with the uncomfortable weight of something he was going to have to fight for. The acquisition order was invalid. Not marginally, not arguably. It was procedurally deficient in at least 2 distinct ways that any territorial judge would have to acknowledge. The Transcontinental Land Authority had cut corners, almost certainly because someone with money and a deadline had told them to. Chester folded the documents carefully and slid them back toward her. "I need to send a telegraph to Santa Fe tonight," he said, and I'm going to recommend the acquisition order be suspended pending proper territorial court review." He paused. "I want to be clear with you about what comes next. The authority is not going to like this. Briggs, my supervisor, is very comfortable with the railroad's politics. He is going to push back. Will you push back at him?" "Yes." Something in her face changed then, and for just a moment Chester Lockhart saw, past all that fierce and disciplined competence, the depth of what this was costing her. The exhaustion of 2 months of fighting this alone, the weight of a dying father and a threatened home, and the sheer solitary work of being the only person standing between her family and a disaster that most people in her position would not have had the knowledge to fight at all. It lasted only a moment before she gathered herself again, but he had seen it, and it went into him like a splinter, small, immediate, impossible to ignore. "Thank you," she said quietly. He picked up his hat from the table and stood. "I have a telegraph to send," he said. "I'll ride out to the Diamond Sea tomorrow morning. I want to speak with you about next steps." She stood as well, shouldering her satchel. She was almost eye level with his chin, and up close he could see the faint, permanent squint lines around her eyes that came from years of reading in imperfect light and watching horizons with the kind of constant vigilance that was not paranoia, but simply the knowledge that the territory did not forgive inattention. "Marshal," she said, "yes. Why are you doing this, really, not the duty explanation?" Chester held her gaze for a moment. "Because what was done to your family was wrong," he said. "And I've been in this work long enough that I don't have a lot of room left for convenient blindness." He put his hat on and walked out of the Silver Fork into the blue evening air of Clearwater Creek, and the telegraph office was 2 blocks east, and he had a very uncomfortable message to compose to his supervisor in Santa Fe. Briggs's reply came the next morning, and it was exactly what Chester had anticipated: a terse instruction to proceed with the original order, and a reminder that the Transcontinental Land Authority had federal authority that superseded territorial court jurisdictions. Chester read it twice in the telegraph office, folded it, put it in his breast pocket, and rode to the Diamond Sea. The ranch was everything the land grant documents had suggested and then some. Riding in through the front gate, a handsome timber arch with the Diamond Sea brand burned into the crossbeam, Chester could see the scale of what the Cooper family had built. The main house was solid adobe and timber, low and wide, with a broad covered porch. Behind it were a hay barn, a working barn, a smokehouse, 3 separate corrals. The cattle in the near pasture were good stock, well fed and well managed. The whole operation had the particular quality of something maintained with pride over a long time, not prosperous in a showy way, but deeply cared for. Julia was in the nearest corral when he arrived, and Chester pulled his horse up at the fence and stopped. She was breaking a horse. Not gently, either, not the slow, patient groundwork that some trainers favored, but the full working version of it. a young bay gelding that was spinning and bucking with real violence, and Julia Cooper on his back like she had been grown there, sitting deep in the saddle with her heels down and her reins steady, and her entire body moving with the horse's motion rather than against it, riding every lurch and spin with a fluid, effortless authority that made it look like cooperation rather than contest. The gelding threw everything it had at her, a hard stop, a crow hop, a spinning buck that would have unseated most riders, and she rode it all. Smooth, certain, unhurried. Chester's horse, which was a steady quarter-horse gelding that had ridden into 2 gunfights without losing its nerve, shifted nervously at the fence and Chester had to settle him. After another few minutes, the bay gelding stopped fighting and began to breathe in long, blowing sighs, dropping his head, and Julia walked him in a slow circle around the corral, sitting quietly, letting the horse settle. Then she stepped off and handed the lead line to a young ranch hand who had been watching from the corner, and she climbed through the fence rails. She had not, Chester noticed, been watching him do any of this. She had been completely focused on the horse. It was only now, brushing the corral dust from her trousers, that she acknowledged his presence. "Marshal," she said. "Miss Cooper," he hesitated. "That horse nearly threw you 3 times. "No," she said without particular arrogance. "He never came close. He telegraphed every move first. You just have to learn how to read them." She looked at his horse and then back at him. "What did Denver say?" "Not what I recommended." She nodded. She had expected this. "I want to be honest with you," Chester said, dismounting and looping his reins over the fence post. "I sent the recommendation and it was rejected. My supervisor is citing federal authority over territorial jurisdiction. What he's not acknowledging, and what I intend to force him to acknowledge, is that there is a specific precedent from 1878, the Holt versus Land Authority ruling in the Colorado Territory, that sets exactly the terms your land grant charter invokes. I need to put that precedent in front of him formally, in a written report, not a telegraph. That's going to take me 3 or 4 days to compile correctly." Julia looked at him with an expression he was beginning to recognize, the focused, evaluating look of someone who was always 2 steps ahead of any conversation and was measuring the distance. "You know the Holt ruling," she said. "I know it. I was serving in Colorado when it came down. The case involved a ranch family whose patent grant charter was similarly situated, and the court held that federal eminent domain acquisition in a territory required the territorial court's involvement regardless of what the acquiring body claimed about its federal authority. Thomas Arkin wrote to me about that ruling," Julia said slowly. "When it happened, he thought it might become relevant someday." Chester looked at her. "Your lawyer friend he's in Albuquerque now. He moved his practice 3 years ago." She paused. "If you are compiling a formal report citing the Holt precedent, I can give you the original letter Thomas wrote me analyzing it. It includes a breakdown of the specific legal mechanism that the Colorado court relied upon. It might sharpen the argument." Chester stared at her for a moment. "You've had a legal analysis of the Holt ruling sitting in your files for years." "I told you," she said, with the faintest trace of something that was not quite a smile but was in the same neighborhood. "I prepared." He laughed. It came out of him sudden and genuine before he could suppress it, a short, full laugh that surprised him as much as it appeared to surprise her. She blinked, and then something warm and involuntary moved across her face, and she looked away quickly, squinting toward the far pasture. "Come inside," she said. "I'll find Thomas's letter, and I have coffee if you want it." The kitchen of the Cooper house was large and practical, with an iron cook stove and a long table and shelves of organized supplies that told the same story as the corral, everything in its place, everything cared for, nothing wasted. Julia's father, William Cooper, was not in the kitchen. Through a doorway Chester could hear the slow, labored breathing of a very ill man, and he felt the particular hollow ache of that, the breathing of someone who had not much time left to breathe. Julia put coffee on without comment and went to a heavy wooden chest in the corner, opened it, and began going through papers with the methodical speed of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for. Chester leaned against the kitchen counter and watched her. "How long has your father been ill?" he asked. "Since January." She found the letter she was looking for and set it aside, kept going through the chest. "His heart. The doctor says the muscle has weakened past the point of recovery." She found another document, added it to the first. "He knows what's happening. With the land, I mean. I told him because he would have been angrier if I had tried to protect him from it. He asked me to handle it. And so you did. So I am." She brought the papers to the table, and Chester sat across from her and read Thomas Arkin's letter, which was dated 1878, and was the most cogent six-page legal analysis he had encountered outside a professional court filing. It laid out the implications of the Holt ruling with the precision of a surgeon and the clarity of someone who genuinely loved the law and wanted to make sure his reader understood every implication. "He's good," Chester said. "He's brilliant," Julia corrected. "He should have had a larger practice. He was the wrong color for most courts to take seriously." She said it matter-of-factly, without anger, though the injustice of it was plain in the plainness of her tone, the way people name things that are wrong and continuously wrong. Chester looked up from the letter. "He taught you well." "He gave me the tools," she said. "I taught myself. There's a difference. Thomas would say the same thing." She poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of him. "The women in this territory who know the law could fill a thimble. I decided I wasn't going to be one of the ones who didn't." Chester wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at it and thought about the women he had met in his years of territorial work. Most of them defined by what they lacked and what they depended upon, not through any fault of character, but through sheer exclusion from every system that might have given them otherwise. And here was Julia Cooper in her dusty riding clothes with her legal files and her land grant charter analysis and her brilliant lawyer correspondent. And she had built herself into something the system had never intended her to be, because she had refused to accept the alternative. He realized he had been quiet too long when she looked at him questioningly. "Nothing," he said, "just thinking. About how many fights get won or lost before they even start," he said, "because of who prepared and who didn't." She looked at him steadily for a moment, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement, he thought, of something they shared. The knowledge that the world rewards preparation and punishes its absence, and that most people never understand this until it is too late. "I'll need to take these letters to compile the report," he said. "I'll make copies before I send anything, so you keep the originals." "I trust you," she said, and then looked slightly startled, as if the words had come out before she had cleared them for departure. Chester felt them land in his chest with a weight that was entirely disproportionate to the context. "I'll take good care of them," he said. He spent 3 days at the hotel in Clearwater Creek, writing the most comprehensive legal report of his career. He was methodical about it, citing every relevant statute, every precedential ruling, every procedural requirement that the Transcontinental Land Authority had failed to meet in the preparation of the acquisition order. He incorporated Thomas Arkin's analysis of the Holt ruling and wove it through his own argument like a thread of steel through cloth. He cited the specific language of the land grant charter. He documented the absence of a territorial court ruling. He identified the procedural deficiencies in the order itself with numbered specificity. When it was finished, it was 14 pages long, and Chester read it back to himself and knew it was the strongest thing he had ever written on paper. He had it copied by the hotel keeper's son, who had careful handwriting, and sent 1 copy by courier to his supervisor in Santa Fe, and 1 directly to the federal court office in the territorial capital. Then he rode out to the Diamond Sea, because he wanted to tell Julia in person. She was on the roof of the hay barn when he arrived. He stopped his horse and looked up, genuinely puzzled, and then saw that she was relaying cedar shingles on a section that had evidently blown loose in the spring winds. She had a nail apron on and a hammer in her hand and was moving along the slope of the roof with the same easy confidence she brought to everything, apparently unconcerned by the 15-foot drop on 3 sides of her. "Miss Cooper," he called. She looked down. "Marshal, the report. Sent this morning. 14 pages." She sat back on her heels and looked at him with an expression that was part relief, part careful optimism, part the wariness of someone who has been disappointed enough times to protect herself against hope. "How long until we hear back? Hard to say. The federal court office may respond faster than Briggs. If the court office engages with the Holt argument, it could force a pause on the acquisition order within the week. If Briggs fights it, it could take longer." He paused. "Can you come down? I have some questions about the water rights documentation." She came down. She always moved with the same quality, economical, certain, nothing wasted. She pulled the nail apron off and dropped it over a fence post and pushed her hair back from her face. There was a smear of tar from the shingles across her right forearm. She either did not notice it or did not care, and Chester found, to his own mild bewilderment, that this was one of the most attractive qualities he had ever encountered in another person. They sat on the front porch of the main house with her water rights files spread between them, and Chester asked his questions and she answered them. And somewhere during the third question, William Cooper's voice came faintly through the front door, asking for water, and Julia excused herself and went inside, and Chester sat alone on the porch and looked out over 4,000 acres of good New Mexico land and thought about the nature of what was worth fighting for. She came back out after a few minutes. "He's having a better morning," she said, sitting back down. "He wants to know if you'll come in and speak with him." Chester paused. "He wants to meet me." "He wants to meet the federal marshal who is apparently trying to help us instead of harm us," she said. "He said, and I'm quoting directly, that he'd like to determine whether you're the genuine article or just a new variety of government snake." Chester almost smiled. Fair enough. William Cooper was 70 years old and looked it in every way except his eyes, which were dark and sharp and very much his daughter's eyes. He was propped in the bed with pillows, and his breathing was effortful, but his mind was clearly unimpaired, because he looked Chester over with the unhurried assessment of a man who had spent a lifetime judging horses and cattle and people, and had developed equal accuracy in all 3 categories. "Sit down," William said. Chester sat in the chair Julia indicated beside the bed. "My daughter says you sent a legal report to Santa Fe on our behalf." "On behalf of due process," Chester said. "Your family's land grant was improperly handled by the authority. I documented it." William was quiet for a moment, looking at him. "You know what this land means to us." "I have some idea." "No," William said, not unkindly. "You have a professional idea. Let me give you a personal one. I came here in 1851 when this was nothing. Literally nothing, not a fence post, not a well, not a name on a map that anyone had bothered to write down. My wife Alina and I dug the first well by hand. We built the first structure with our own hands. We lost 2 children before Julia, 2 boys born out here, buried in this ground. Alina herself is buried half a mile east of this house, under the oak tree she planted from a seed she carried all the way from Virginia." He paused to gather breath. "This is not property to us. You understand? It is not real estate. It is the whole shape of our lives." Chester sat with this. "I understand," he said, and meant it differently than he had meant most things in the last few years. "Julia is the only thing I've done that I am completely proud of," William said, and looked toward the doorway where his daughter had gone. "She is smarter than anyone in this territory, and she is tougher than most men I've known, and she has been running this operation practically by herself for 2 years while I have been declining. She never complained. She never asked for help she didn't think was worth asking for." His eyes came back to Chester. "Whatever help you're giving us, I need you to know it matters. Not because of the land, because of her. She has been carrying this alone for a long time." Chester rode back to Clearwater Creek that evening with William Cooper's words sitting heavy and warm in his chest, and he thought about Julia on the roof of the barn and Julia at the saloon table with her organized legal files, and Julia riding the bay gelding through its fury without fear. And he thought about the loneliness of carrying a fight alone for 2 months, of being the only intelligent person in a room full of disinterest, of having every resource you needed except one other person who understood. He sent a second telegraph to Santa Fe that night. This one to a different contact, an old Army acquaintance named Declan Marsh, who now worked as a clerk in the federal court office, and who Chester had once pulled out of a very bad situation in Colorado, and who had been looking for a way to repay the debt for 3 years. The telegraph asked Declan to pull the Holt ruling and the relevant territorial statutes and flag the report Chester had sent directly to the court office for expedited review. It was not strictly procedurally appropriate. Chester sent it anyway. The response from Declan came the following morning. He had flagged it. The duty judge was a man named Harlan Price who was, according to Declan, a scrupulous textualist who loved nothing better than catching the land authority overstepping its bounds, because he had a standing grudge with the authority's director dating back to a land dispute in 1879. Chester read this and permitted himself exactly 1 moment of quiet satisfaction before he got back to work. 3 days later, the situation changed in a way Chester had not anticipated, which was that Alderman Briggs arrived in Clearwater Creek in person. Briggs was a large man, florid-faced, with the particular bearing of someone who had been comfortable and powerful for so long that he had entirely forgotten what it felt like not to be. He arrived with 2 other Marshal's men Chester knew by name, professional and competent and very loyal to Briggs, and he found Chester at the hotel dining room over breakfast and sat down without invitation and said, "You are making a very significant career error, Lockhart." Chester put down his fork. "Good morning, Alderman. The report you sent to the court office, do you have any idea what you've done? Judge Price has issued a temporary suspension of the acquisition order. The railroad's lawyers are furious. The land authority director has personally been on the telegraph to the governor's office. All of which suggests," Chester said, "that the legal argument I made was sound." Briggs leaned across the table. "This is not about legal arguments. This is about a federal expansion corridor that the United States government has a vested interest in completing on schedule. The Cooper land is in that corridor. The acquisition was authorized." "It was authorized without the procedurally required territorial court ruling," Chester said. "That's not a technicality. That's the law." "The law," Briggs said with a dismissive wave of his hand, "is a tool. Sometimes you use it and sometimes you work around it when larger interests are at stake." "I disagree," Chester said, "and I think a federal judge in Santa Fe disagrees, which is why there is currently a temporary suspension order on file." Briggs sat back and studied him with narrowed eyes. "The Cooper girl," he said, and his tone shifted into something that Chester did not like. "You've been spending time out at that ranch. The case required it, has it? Or is there something personal clouding your judgment here, Lockhart? Because from where I'm sitting, you look like a man who has let a pretty face and a hard luck story turn him away from his duty." Chester was quiet for a moment that was precisely long enough. "I am going to tell you something, Alderman," he said, with a calm that required more effort than it showed. "The woman you just described is one of the most legally sophisticated people I have encountered in 6 years of federal work. She identified the procedural deficiency in the acquisition order before I did, and she has been building a documented legal case in anticipation of exactly this fight for 2 months. She is not a hard luck story. She is a person whose legal rights were being violated, and I did my job by identifying that and reporting it." He stood up from the table and dropped money for his breakfast. "I'm going to the Diamond Sea this morning. You're welcome to come along if you'd like to see the documentation for yourself." Briggs did not come along, but the 2 other marshals followed Chester at a distance when he rode out. He could see them in the mirror of his attention on the trail, and he thought about the word trap for a while and what exactly Briggs had in mind. He found Julia at the main house, and he told her quickly and directly what had happened. She listened without interruption, and when he was done she was quiet for a moment and then said, "He came in person." "Yes. That means the railroad is more invested than we knew, or the authority director is. Someone with real money is pushing this." She looked at the window, thinking. "The water rights," she said suddenly. "Chester, the reason I said that yesterday about the water rights documentation, it's not just the land they want. The Diamond Sea Creek runs through the South Quarter, and it's the only reliable year-round water source in this section of the proposed corridor. Without access to that water, the railroad cannot cost-effectively build the section they need. The acquisition isn't just about the land. It's about the water rights that come with it." Chester stared at her. "If the water rights transfer separately from the land, they don't," she said. "Not under the patent grant. The water rights are appurtenant to the land. They transfer together or not at all, which means the railroad cannot build the corridor the way they've planned it without acquiring both, and they cannot acquire both without the proper court process, which is now suspended. Which means," Chester said slowly, "that your temporary suspension is worth significantly more to them than just one family's 4,000 acres. Yes," she met his eyes. "Which also means they have significant financial incentive to remove the obstacle." They looked at each other across the kitchen. "What kind of men are these other marshals Briggs brought with him?" she asked. "Professional, not gunfighters exactly. But they do what they're told. Would they do something illegal if they were told? I don't think Briggs has the nerve to go that far, but I'm not certain." She nodded. "Then we need to move faster than they do." She was already at the wooden chest, pulling files. "I need to write to Thomas Arkin today. If there's a hearing scheduled before Judge Price, I need Thomas there. He knows the Holt ruling better than anyone, and his analysis is what I want the judge to see presented by a practicing attorney." She looked up. "Can you stay here tonight? I don't want to be out at this ranch alone with Briggs's men riding around the territory if there's any chance this gets aggressive." Chester did not hesitate. "Yes," he said. That night, after William Cooper was settled, Chester sat on the front porch with Julia while the stars came out over the New Mexico desert in their vast, indifferent abundance, and they talked. Not about the case, about everything else. She asked him where he had grown up, and he told her about Missouri, about the poverty of it, about the absolute determination it had created in him to understand the world well enough to manage it instead of being managed by it. She told him about growing up on the Diamond Sea, about the years when it was only her and her father after Alina died, about learning to read horse behavior and cattle patterns, and weather before she learned algebra. She told him about the dry years when the creek had run low and they had thought they might lose the herd, and about the good years when the grass had been so thick and green that it seemed impossible that anything bad could ever find them. She told him about the loneliness of it sometimes, of being the only person her age within 20 miles who she could talk to about anything that mattered. "You never thought of leaving?" he asked. "Many times," she said honestly. "I thought about finding a city, Albuquerque, Denver, somewhere with a library worth the name and people who read books for pleasure and might want to argue about ideas. But then I would look at the land in the morning light and I would think, who else is going to take care of this? My father needed me here. The ranch needed someone who understood it. I could not leave a thing I loved because being with it was hard." Chester looked at her in the starlight and felt something that he recognized, distantly, as the thing that happens when you have been alone for a long time and another person's company suddenly feels like the answer to a question you had forgotten you were asking. "What is it?" she said, reading his silence. "I was just thinking," he said, "that I have been doing a job that has moved me from place to place for 6 years without letting me stay anywhere long enough to want to. And I never thought of that as a loss until fairly recently." She was quiet. Then, "How recently?" He looked at her and she looked back, and the silence between them had the quality of something that did not need to be filled immediately. "Fairly recently," he said again, and she held his gaze for one moment more before she looked back at the stars, and he could not see her expression clearly in the dark, but he thought, from the particular quality of her stillness, that she was managing something she was not yet ready to name. The letter from Thomas Arkin arrived 4 days later, carried express by a courier who had ridden hard from Albuquerque. It confirmed that Thomas was already aware of the suspension order from a contact in the court office, that he had reviewed Chester's report and found it legally excellent, and that he would be in Clearwater Creek within the week for a preliminary meeting with Judge Price, who had agreed to hold a hearing on the acquisition challenge within 2 weeks. 2 weeks was fast. 2 weeks was, Chester thought, reading the letter at the hotel while drinking his morning coffee, the kind of speed that suggested Judge Price was interested in this case for his own reasons, probably the standing grudge with the land authority director that Declan had mentioned. That was fine. Chester was not in a position to be selective about what motivated justice, as long as it arrived. He also, that morning, received formal notice from the federal marshal's office that he was being temporarily reassigned to Clearwater Creek pending resolution of the Cooper land acquisition matter. This was Briggs's work, a way to keep Chester contained and visible rather than letting him operate freely. Chester read the reassignment notice and felt no particular concern about it, because being officially stationed in Clearwater Creek was going to make the next 2 weeks considerably easier. Thomas Arkin arrived on a Thursday, a compact, dark-skinned man in his 50s with silver-streaked hair, and a manner of absolute professional certainty that made the hotel lobby seem, briefly, like a courtroom. He and Julia greeted each other with the warmth of people who have conducted an important relationship almost entirely on paper, and are discovering that the reality is better than the correspondence. "You look like someone who has not slept enough for 2 months," Thomas told her, setting his briefcase down. "You look like someone who has been practicing his opening argument in the mirror," she replied. "Guilty," he said. "Chester Lockhart." He turned and extended his hand to Chester. "Your report was the best piece of legal work I have seen from a non-attorney since I started practicing. Specifically, the way you threaded the Holt precedent with the charter language. It's exactly the argument I would have made, and it's the argument Price is going to have to acknowledge." "Julia gave me the foundation," Chester said. "The Holt analysis, the water rights research, she had most of it ready." Thomas looked between them with the expression of a man who is noticing something that is not strictly related to the legal case, and then he looked back at Julia with a very small smile that Julia appeared to deliberately not see. The three of them spent 2 days working through the case together at the hotel dining room, Thomas directing, Julia contributing, Chester filling in the federal procedural elements that Thomas needed clarified. It was, Chester thought, the most intellectually engaged he had felt in years, and the engagement was inseparable from the specific pleasure of watching Julia think out loud, following the rapid and precise movement of her mind through complex material, watching Thomas match her step for step while Chester held the practical framework steady. Briggs made one more attempt at interference. He came to the hotel on the second day, accompanied by his 2 marshals, and attempted to formally instruct Chester to withdraw his legal objection to the acquisition order on the grounds that it represented an unauthorized use of federal marshal authority. Chester listened to this instruction in the hotel lobby, with Thomas Arkin standing 3 feet to his right, and said, "I appreciate the instruction, Alderman. I'll address it in writing with a copy to Judge Price, who has already reviewed the basis of my objection and deemed it relevant to the proceedings." Briggs looked at Thomas. "Who are you?" "Thomas Arkin," Thomas said pleasantly. "Attorney. I've been retained by the Cooper family." He held out a hand that Briggs did not shake. "We'll see each other in the hearing, I imagine." Briggs left. The 2 shadowing marshals left with him. Thomas watched them go and said, without turning around, "There's a darkness in that man that has money behind it. We should be careful." "I know," Chester said. That evening Chester went to the Diamond Sea alone. It was not strictly necessary. He had no case business to conduct there that evening, and he knew it and went anyway, because the honest truth was that 2 days of hotel dining room legal work had left him with a particular and growing need to see Julia in the context of her own life, in the place that she fought for, rather than in the abstract frame of a case file. She was in the near pasture with the bay gelding he had watched her break, working him on a long lunge line in slow circles. The gelding was a different animal than he had been a week ago, responsive, light-footed, his earlier wildness converted into something energetic and willing. Julia watched him move with the concentrated attention of a craftsman evaluating the product of patient work. Chester leaned on the fence and watched. After a few minutes she drew the horse in and unsnapped the line and turned him loose in the pasture, and he stood for a moment quivering, looking at the open space, and then dropped his head and began to graze. Julia came to the fence. "He's ready to start actual work next week," she said. "He's going to be a good horse." "You knew that when you were breaking him." "I suspected it. You can tell something about a horse's character in the first 5 minutes on its back." She leaned on the fence beside him, looking out at the grazing gelding. "I named the good ones." "What did you name him?" "Argument," she said. Chester looked at her. She glanced sideways at him, and there was that almost smile again. "Because he's smart enough to know what he wants and stubborn enough to insist on it," she said, "but he has the sense to eventually listen to reason." Chester felt warmth move through his chest. "Are you describing the horse?" She looked away. "Probably both of us," she said quietly. He was quiet for a moment. The late sun was making long copper light across the grass and the horse in her profile, and he was thinking about William Cooper's words, "She has been carrying this alone for a long time," and about 2 months of solitary preparation and 6 months of ranch work and grieving for a dying father. "Julia," he said. She looked at him. "After this is resolved, after the hearing, I need to tell you something." She waited. "I am not going to be able to leave Clearwater Creek," he said. "I mean, my assignment here technically ends when the case resolves, but I don't think I'm going to be able to leave." He could see the careful effort it cost her not to react immediately, the way she managed her expression like a woman who had been managing her feelings alone for a long time and was not sure yet how to let someone else be responsible for any of them. "Chester," she said, very quietly. "I know this is an unusual situation," he said. "I know there's still a hearing and a legal fight and your father and 1,000 things that are more immediate than whatever this is, but I thought you should know, so that it is not a hidden thing between us." She looked at him for a long moment, the amber-brown eyes, the copper evening light on her face, and something in her expression shifted, not to softness exactly, but to a kind of openness that had not been there before, a lowering of the last careful guard. "I thought you were going to be one more government problem," she said. "I know. You are the most unexpected thing that has happened to me in a very long time. Is that good or bad?" She looked at the horse and back at him, and that almost smile became, for just a moment, fully itself. "I'm not sure yet," she said. "Ask me after the hearing." The hearing before Judge Harlan Price took place in the Territorial Courthouse in Santa Fe, because Price had insisted on his own courtroom rather than traveling to Clearwater Creek. Chester and Julia made the journey by rail, a long day's travel with Thomas Arkin, and Briggs and the Land Authority Director, a sharp-faced man named Greenwold, were already there when they arrived. The hearing was 2 days long. Thomas Arkin argued the charter case with the meticulous brilliance of a man who had been preparing for this moment longer than the case had technically existed, weaving the Holt precedent into the patent grant language, into the procedural deficiency argument, into an overall presentation that was hard and clear as cut glass. Chester testified as the investigating marshal, presenting his documented findings with the flat, credible precision of someone who had nothing to gain from embellishment. The Land Authority's lawyers pushed back hard on both, arguing federal authority, arguing the urgency of the railroad expansion, arguing precedent from a different case that Thomas dismantled so thoroughly that one of Price's clerks actually whispered something to another clerk, and they both looked impressed. Julia sat in the gallery throughout, straight-backed and still, wearing a dark dress that she had brought specifically for the purpose. The only time Chester had seen her in something other than work clothes, and she watched the proceedings with the focused intensity of someone who understood every word and was evaluating it in real time. On the evening of the first day, in the corridor outside the courtroom, Greenwald approached Chester directly and offered, with the blandness of someone who had made this kind of offer many times, a substantial sum of money to withdraw his documented objection. Chester looked at him for a moment with the particular expression of a man whose patience with a conversation has reached its limit, and said, "I'm going to pretend you didn't say that, because if I don't pretend, I'm going to have to report it to Judge Price in the morning, and that will not improve your situation." Greenwald went away. Julia had witnessed this from 10 feet down the corridor. She came to Chester when Greenwald was gone and said, "He offered you money." "Yes. That tells us how worried they are." "Yes." "Good," she said simply. And then, after a pause, "Thank you. You don't need to thank me for not being bribed. I'm thanking you for being the kind of man it would never occur to me to worry about." She said it with a quiet certainty, as if it were something she had considered and concluded with the same methodical care she brought to everything. Chester looked at her and thought about the word forbidden. Not because he thought this was forbidden exactly, but because it had felt that way at first, the feeling between them, like something he was supposed to keep at arm's length because of duty or professionalism or the simple complication of the situation. And now it no longer felt forbidden. It felt necessary. He did not say that. There was a hearing tomorrow and he needed to be clear-headed. And he was a man who believed in timing, which was another word for patience, which was the only quality he had that was native to him rather than acquired. On the second day, Judge Price heard closing arguments and then retired to consider his ruling. He came back at 3 in the afternoon with 11 pages of written judgment that his clerk read aloud while the courtroom listened. The acquisition order was struck down. The ruling held that the Transcontinental Land Authority's acquisition order for the Diamond Sea Ranch was procedurally invalid under the terms of the Federal Patent Grant Charter, that the proper eminent domain process had not been followed, and that any future acquisition attempt would require full territorial court review and a separate formal valuation proceeding in which the landowners had the right to contest the offered price. The ruling further noted, in language that was pointed enough to make Greenwald's face go a specific shade of brick red, that the authorities' pattern of bypassing territorial courts in the New Mexico district appeared to constitute a systemic procedural failure that the court recommended the Federal Oversight Board investigate. Thomas Arkin gathered his papers with the controlled satisfaction of a surgeon closing a clean incision. Chester sat very still for a moment, feeling the judgment settle through him. And then he looked at Julia. She had both hands pressed flat on the gallery railing in front of her, and she was absolutely still, and her eyes were bright with something she was holding back by main force. Not tears exactly, or not only tears, but the overwhelming full accumulation of 2 months of fear and fight and preparation, all of it suddenly, finally having been worth it. He found her in the corridor afterward, while Thomas was dealing with the other lawyers. She was standing by the window at the end of the hall, looking out at the street below, and when Chester came to stand beside her she turned and looked at him, and she said nothing for a moment. And then she stepped forward and put her arms around him, and he held her, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and took one long breath that felt like the first easy breath she had drawn in 2 months. And Chester held her and thought about William Cooper saying she has been carrying this alone for a long time, and about the night on the porch under the New Mexico stars, and about what it meant to have arrived somewhere and recognized it as the place you had been trying to get to without knowing it. "It's over," he said quietly into her hair. "Not yet," she said equally quietly. "My father is still dying. The ranch still needs everything it always needs. Thomas says there could be appeal attempts." She drew back slightly and looked at him, the amber-brown eyes direct and warm. "But the worst of it is over." "Yes," Chester said. "The worst of it is over." Thomas came out of the courtroom with his briefcase and his expression of controlled professional satisfaction, and stopped when he saw them, and then resumed walking toward them with a smile that he did not bother controlling. "I believe dinner is warranted," he said. "And then I'd like to hear, at dinner, what exactly the plan is for the two of you, because I have spent 6 years reading letters from Julia about law and ranch management and various philosophies, and I think it's time someone rewarded all that sustained intelligence with something she actually wants." Julia made a sound that was half embarrassment and half laughter and looked away. Chester said, "Dinner sounds good." They returned to Clearwater Creek the following day, and Chester went immediately to the Diamond Sea, and William Cooper was having one of his difficult mornings. The breathing worse, the face pale, the doctor already there and looking grave. But when Chester came into the bedroom, William's eyes found him and sharpened. "Heard from the telegraph," William said. His voice was thin now, but his eyes had not changed. "You won." "We won," Chester said. "Your daughter's legal preparation was what made it possible." William looked at his daughter, who was standing in the doorway with her arms folded and her expression very carefully assembled to not show everything she was feeling. He looked at her for a long moment with all the weight of a man who knows how much time he has and is measuring the value of each moment. "Julia," he said, "Papa, come here." She came and sat on the edge of the bed and took his hand, and Chester made to leave, but William said, "Stay, Marshal. I'm old and I'm tired and I don't have the patience for ceremonies. So I'm going to say this plainly." He looked at Chester. "What are your intentions regarding my daughter?" Chester met the old man's eyes without hesitation. "I intend to stay," he said, "in Clearwater Creek. If there's a place for a former federal marshal in this county, and I believe the sheriff has mentioned there might be a deputy sheriff position available, I intend to take it. I intend to become someone worth knowing in this place, over time, if that is allowed." He looked at Julia as he said the last part, not at William. Julia was watching him with the expression of someone who is refusing to make something easy, and is doing so because she respects the person enough to require that they mean it. "And if I told you," William said slowly, "that my daughter is not a woman who makes things easy." "Then I would say that nothing worth having is easy," Chester said, "and that I have been in the habit of doing difficult things for long enough that I do not know how to want something simple." William looked at Julia. Julia looked at Chester. The room was quiet except for the difficult labor of an old man's breathing. "He'll do," William said to his daughter, and closed his eyes. William Cooper died 6 weeks later on a warm July morning, with Julia holding his hand and the sound of the Diamond Sea going about its morning business outside the window, cattle lowing, horses moving in the corral, the creek audible from the south in the still air. Chester was on the porch, not wanting to intrude, and when Julia came to the door an hour later she looked at him with a face that was utterly stripped of its usual careful composure and said only, "He's gone." And Chester stood up and went to her, and she did not step back, and this time she wept, actually wept, which he understood was something she had been saving up for a very long time. They buried William Cooper beside a leaner, under the oak tree she had planted from a seed carried from Virginia, and Thomas Arkin came from Albuquerque for the service, and Sheriff Orrin Webb came, and half the county came, because William Cooper had been in this valley for 30 years, and people remembered what that meant. Chester resigned his federal marshal position formally 2 weeks after the funeral. He submitted his resignation to Briggs's office with a letter that was professional and thorough and entirely without apology, and he applied for the deputy sheriff position in Clearwater County that Webb had mentioned, and he was appointed to it within the month. The months that followed were a kind of education that Chester had not known he needed. He learned the Diamond Sea the way you learn anything real, by living inside it, by showing up every day and doing the work and listening to the knowledge that existed in every corner of the place. Julia was a demanding and entirely fair teacher. She did not make things easier than they were, but she also never expected perfection from someone still learning, only full attention and genuine effort. Chester had both of those in abundance. There was a foreman named Hector who had been with the Diamond Sea for 15 years, a lean and precise man who communicated primarily through brief utterances and significant silences, and who evaluated Chester with the impartial thoroughness of a man who had seen too many people come and fail to waste time on premature verdicts. After 3 months, Hector said to Chester, while they were mending a section of the south fence, "You sit a horse well." Chester understood this to be a profoundly significant compliment. He and Julia moved toward each other slowly and honestly, the way things move that are rooted, not with the urgency of people who are afraid it might be taken away, but with the steadiness of people who have each, separately, decided that they know what they want and are willing to build it carefully. He kissed her for the first time on a November evening when they were riding back from checking the south herd, and the sun was going down in layers of red and gold over the mesas. And they were not talking about anything important, and she said something that made him laugh, and he looked at her and thought about every reason why there was no reason not to anymore, and he reached across the space between their horses and touched her face, and she turned toward him, and it was as simple as that. She said afterward, walking their horses in the cooling air, "I knew the night on the porch." "Which night?" "The first one, when you told me you weren't going to be able to leave." She looked sideways at him. "I knew then, I just had to make sure you meant it." "How long did it take to be sure?" "About 3 weeks," she said. "But I'm methodical. I like to have documentation." He laughed, and she smiled that full smile that was still one of the rarest and most valuable things he had encountered, and the horses walked, and the mesas went dark purple in the last light. He proposed to her in the spring of 1883, on the front porch of the Cooper house. Their porch, he had begun to think of it, because he had been mending its boards and replacing its posts all winter, and it had taken on the quality of something that was partially his in the way things become yours through care. He did not make it complicated. He sat beside her in the evening, and he told her that he loved her intelligence and her stubbornness and her preparedness and her generosity, and the way she rode argument, and the way she had stood in his parlor that very first day with his government document, and said, "I suppose we are going to have a very interesting problem," and he asked her if she would marry him. Julia was quiet for a moment in the particular way that was not uncertainty, but was the full and deliberate consideration of something important. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." They were married in June of 1883 in the yard of the Diamond Sea, because neither of them wanted to be anywhere else. Thomas Arkin came from Albuquerque and was the best man by acclamation, and gave a toast that made everyone laugh and then made Julia cry in the good way. And Sheriff Orrin Webb and Hector and all the ranch hands were there. And it was the kind of wedding that was exactly itself straightforward, warm, rooted in a specific place, and the specific people who had been shaped by it. That night, sitting on the porch in the dark after everyone had gone, Julia leaned against Chester's shoulder and said, "Do you know what I thought when I first saw you ride up to the house? That I was another problem to be solved. That you looked like you were worth arguing with," she said. "Most people aren't. Most people, you make an argument and they fold or they get angry and neither response is interesting. You read the documents, you asked precise questions, you changed your mind when the evidence required it. That is the most attractive thing a person can do. Change their mind. Be honest enough to change their mind when they're wrong," she said. "That's rare." Chester pressed his lips to the top of her head. "I had very good evidence," he said. She laughed, soft and private, and the dark New Mexico sky spread its usual impossible quantity of stars over the Diamond Sea, and they sat together in comfortable and complete silence, and it was enough, and it was everything. Their son was born in March of 1884. They named him William for Julia's father, and he came into the world with considerable noise and immediate opinions, which Chester took as an excellent sign. Julia held him in the bedroom while the spring light came through the window, and the creek could be heard from the south. And Chester sat on the edge of the bed with his arm around her, and looked at his son's face, new and furious and perfect, and felt a depth of feeling for which he had no adequate language and did not try to find any. Thomas Arkin came to see the baby and said William was the most opinionated-looking infant he had seen in a decade, which was obviously the highest possible praise. Hector held him for approximately 4 seconds, looked satisfied, and handed him back and went to check on the horses. Sheriff Webb rode out with a bottle of brandy and a hand-carved toy horse that he had made himself, and sat at the kitchen table with Chester while Julia slept, and they talked about the territory and what it was becoming and whether it was becoming it fast enough. "You look," Webb said, "like a man who has arrived somewhere." Chester thought about that. "Yes," he said, "I think I have." The legal threat from the Transcontinental Land Authority did not simply disappear with the court ruling. There were 2 appeal attempts in 1883 and 1884, both of which Thomas Arkin handled, though Julia contributed substantial research to both, because she was not the kind of person who delegated the defense of her own land to someone else when she could be useful. Both appeals failed. The second appeal was dismissed by the Federal Court of Appeals in Denver with language that was pointed enough to constitute a public humiliation for the Land Authority, and after that the railroad adjusted its planned corridor south by several miles, around the Diamond Sea rather than through it, which was more expensive but apparently less trouble than continuing to fight a family with Thomas Arkin on retainer and Julia Cooper doing their research. Chester served as deputy sheriff of Clearwater County for 4 years, and in 1886 he was elected sheriff when Orrin Webb retired. Webb made a point of giving a long and sincere speech at the election results gathering, saying that Chester Lockhart was the best lawman he had ever known, and would have been even without the steadying influence of the extraordinary woman he had married, but that the extraordinary woman had certainly not hurt anything. Julia kissed Chester on the cheek in public when the results were announced, which was not something she did often because she was, constitutionally, more inclined to private expression than public display. The fact that she did it anyway made Chester happier than the election result, which was already making him quite happy. The Diamond Sea continued to be what it had always been, a working ranch, cared for by people who understood that its real value was not in its acres or its cattle or its water rights, though all of those mattered, but in the accumulated decades of human attention and love that had made it what it was. Chester learned it the way Julia had learned law, by sustained, dedicated attention, by reading everything available and asking questions when reading was not enough, by the patient accumulation of practical knowledge that has no shortcut. Their second child was a daughter, born in 1886, whom they named Eleanor for Julia's mother. Eleanor arrived in the world considerably more calmly than her brother had, looked around the room with an expression of considering the evidence, and from that first day displayed the particular quality that Chester recognized, with deep fondness, as her mother's mind. William, at 2, was immediately uncertain about the new arrival, and spent several weeks conducting a campaign of suspicious oversight, before concluding that Eleanor was probably acceptable, and attaching himself to her with the fierce protectiveness of an older sibling, who has decided that something is worth guarding. Thomas Arkin came for the christening, and brought a set of law books that he said were for Eleanor when she was ready for them, which Julia received with tears and Chester received with laughter, and which Thomas defended by saying he believed in early investment in promising minds. The years moved in the good way that years move when you are inside something you have chosen completely, not without difficulty or loss or the ordinary grief of time, but with the particular quality of rightness that comes from being in the correct place with the correct people doing the work that is genuinely yours. Chester was a good sheriff, patient, thorough, not prone to violence but entirely capable of it when the situation was unambiguous, and known throughout the county for the fairness of his judgments and the precision of his memory for the law. Julia ran the Diamond Sea with Hector and a rotating roster of good hands, continued her legal correspondence with Thomas Arkin, who was gradually building a significant practice in the territory, and in 1887 submitted a brief on land grant rights to the New Mexico territorial legislature that was cited by 2 separate court decisions in the following 3 years. She was not a lawyer. She had no formal credential, and the territory would not have given her one regardless of her competence, which was an injustice she named and never stopped naming. But the quality of her legal thinking influenced the legal landscape of New Mexico territory in ways that textbooks did not record and should have. One morning in 1888, Chester came home from his office in Clearwater Creek to find Julia at the kitchen table with a new stack of documents and the particular focused expression that meant she was building a case. He poured himself coffee and sat down across from her and waited. "There is a Navajo family on the east side of the county," she said without looking up, "who have been farming the same land for 3 generations. The land was not formally registered because the federal system was not designed for them to be able to register it. A speculator from Denver has filed a federal claim on it. They are about to lose everything they have built." Chester looked at her. He looked at the documents. He looked at her again. "Thomas is coming next week," he said. "I know. I already wrote to him." She looked up finally and met his eyes. "You are not surprised?" "No," he said, "I am not." She looked at him for a moment with the full warmth of 6 years of marriage and 2 children, and all the accumulated understanding of a shared life. "You knew I was going to do this," she said. "I knew when I first sat across from you at that saloon table," he said, "that you were never going to be someone who only fought for herself. I just needed to wait until you got around to this particular fight." She looked at him, amber-brown eyes, older now, the squint lines a little deeper, her dark hair streaked at the temples with the first threads of silver that she wore without the smallest concern, and he looked at her, and between them was the whole shape of what they had built, solid and detailed and irreplaceable. "I love you," she said, "which I say less often than I think it because I express things through action rather than statement." "I know," he said. "I receive both." She smiled, the full one, the real one, and turned back to her documents. Chester sat across from her and drank his coffee and listened to William crashing around in the yard outside, and Alina's higher voice asking something precise and philosophical that William was probably not equipped to answer, and the sound of the Diamond Sea going about its mourning, and the creek in the distance running clean through the good New Mexico land. The Navajo family's case took the better part of a year. Thomas Arkin handling the court proceedings with Julia's research as his foundation, and Chester using his authority as county sheriff to complicate the speculator's claims at every procedurally appropriate step. The case was ultimately decided in the family's favor, which was not the common outcome in 1889, and which was reported in the territorial newspaper in a manner that suggested even the reporter was surprised. Thomas Arkin said it was the most important case he had ever won. Julia said it was only the beginning of the cases that needed to be won. Chester said nothing, because he was a man who expressed things through action rather than statement, and his action was to keep showing up. By the time New Mexico moved toward statehood, a long, complicated process that would not fully conclude until 1912, the Diamond Sea was an established and prosperous ranch, known throughout the territory for its good cattle and good management. Julia Cooper Lockhart had become, without seeking or receiving any formal recognition for it, one of the most substantive legal minds in the territory, consulted privately by attorneys who knew her work and publicly by almost no one, which was an accurate summary of how the territory treated its women's intelligence regardless of its quality. She did not let it make her bitter. She let it make her more determined, and she poured the determination into the cases she could reach, and the children she was raising and the marriage she had built. And she was, by any honest accounting, a person who had done more with the specific life she was given than almost anyone around her. Chester was gray at the temples by 1895 and still straight-backed, still sharp-eyed, still the kind of man who read every face in a room before committing to an expression on his own. He was known as a fair sheriff and a reliable neighbor, and a man who loved his wife with the particular visibility of someone who has never been embarrassed by a good thing. People in Clearwater Creek had stopped being surprised by them years ago. The rancher's daughter who argued federal law and the marshal who had come to take her land and had stayed to help her keep it, and had arrived at the comfortable territorial verdict that they were exactly what they appeared to be, which was the right people in the right place. William grew into a young man who combined his mother's intelligence with his father's stubbornness and his grandfather's love of the land, and at 16 was already the most reliable calf roper in the county and had begun, on his own initiative, reading the law books Thomas Arkin had been sending over the years. Eleanor, at 10, had already surpassed most of the books available to her in Clearwater Creek, and had begun a correspondence with a schoolteacher in Santa Fe who recognized what she was dealing with and rose to meet it. In the evenings, when the work was done and the children were in their rooms and the Diamond Sea was settling into its nighttime sounds, Chester and Julia sat on the front porch, their porch, fully theirs now in all the ways a thing becomes yours, and talked or were quiet, and the stars came out over the New Mexico sky with their usual impossible generosity, and the creek ran in the south quarter. And the oak tree where Eleanor and William Cooper rested was visible as a dark shape against the lighter dark of the sky, and the whole of it, land and stars and house and family, and the specific irreplaceable weight of the life they had chosen and built, sat around them like something that had always been true and had only needed time to arrive. "Do you ever think about what would have happened," Julia said one evening, "if you had simply served the papers and left?" Chester thought about it honestly, which was the only way he knew how to think. "I think about the version of myself that would have done that," he said. He made sense at the time. He was a man who had learned to keep his head down and do his work and not let himself care too much because caring cost too much. And he would have been a smaller man than the one I wanted to be. He paused. "You made me larger, not by needing anything from me. By being what you were, which forced me to be more than I had been settling for." Julia was quiet for a while. "That is one of the most romantic things you have ever said to me. I'm trying to say them more often. William tells me I'm still not at an adequate frequency." She laughed, surprised and genuine, and leaned against his shoulder, and Chester put his arm around her and they sat in the warm late summer dark, and the stars spread out above the Diamond Sea, and the creek ran, and the horses stood quiet in the corrals, and everything that mattered was right here in this specific place, built by these specific hands, and it was entirely, exactly, sufficiently enough. The government document with the wax seal had been the beginning of the fight, and the fight had produced the life, and the life was this: Julia's shoulder under his arm and the sound of the territory settling into night, and 30 years ahead of them still, and the land exactly where it had always been, rooted in soil that would hold every seed they planted in it, and every dream and every year.